long time ago in a galaxy far away. One of my favourite films as I was growing up in the 70s was indeed Star Wars. It was hard to believe then that C-3PO and R2-D2 might be a real thing during my lifetime, but as I inch closer to retirement, and as I think about an inevitable need for healthcare, the reality of robots and humanoids is already a reality. My guest today is Alexander Guntz, a fund manager for Heptagon Capital in London. Welcome back to the podcast series, Alex. How are you?
It's always a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Andrew. And similar to you, I have very fond memories of Star Wars too, and it is fascinating, as you suggested, to see this becoming reality.
Alex, why don't you start off by distinguishing between a robot and a humanoid? And if you can, what is the current size of that market? And what do you think it will look like in a decade?
I think context is really important as ever, Andrew. And the concept of a robot in any form, this is not in any sense novel. The idea of automation or an automata was something the ancient Greeks talked about. You have to go back a couple of thousand years. But I guess for the context of all of our listeners, the way we conventionally think of robots is actually very crude machines, not really like an RTD or a C-3PO, but simply machines that are able to, say, spray paint cars or help assemble iPhones in like big factories in China and so on. Whereas I think the next step forward, as you highlighted, is this sort of step change. AI, as we're seeing with so many other areas of the world, is driving this. I'm sure we'll come back to talk about this a little bit later on, but you are effectively seeing robots attain capabilities that make them increasingly like humans. And it's almost like a portmanteau to talk about a humanoid robot. So this is a robot that resembles increasingly a human. It may well be bipedal. It will have two legs and it will have 5 fingers. And therefore the number of use cases in which it can be deployed will be significantly greater. Today, we're right at the very beginning of this trend. It's really taking off just as AI is taking off. And yet the industry is growing at about 3 times the rate of the traditional robotics market. So if you project forward, certainly on the numbers that we've seen and we've read, we think that by 2040, this could be a $40 billion industry.
What's the current penetration of robots around the world in absolute terms and in effectiveness, Alex?
Robots are nowhere near as developed, Andrew, as many people might believe. Today, there are only about 3.5 million robots in use globally. So typically when you do the maths, it's about 1 robot for every 1,000 workers. And even if you go into a country like South Korea, I believe has the highest robot penetration, you're about 1 robot for every 100 workers. And typically the geographies where we do see most today are South Korea, China, the States, and Germany.
Now, one of the main drivers of progress is the role of AI in helping improve robotics. How is AI being used to advance humanoid technology?
Well, AI, I think, Andrew, as all of our listeners know, is a massively revolutionary technology. And effectively what we're seeing is just the next stage of its evolution. So typically the path any technology takes is that you begin with this idea of infrastructure, then you go to platforms, then you go to applications. That's really the software side of the story. Then, however, if you listen to anyone who knows anything about AI, particularly, say, some recent commentary from Jensen at NVIDIA, and you would argue that the subsequent stage that we're going to see with AI is really where it becomes physical or embodied AI. So AI not just will reside within software, but it will reside within physical objects as well. And let me give you a case study or an example which perhaps really brings this idea to life. If you or I as a human entered a room and we had to cross that room in order to go and get a drink from a table at a drinks party, say, come back and talk to guests, that would be something that would be second nature to anyone. However, if you're a robot today, it's actually incredibly hard because you need a whole range. We need to respond to a whole range of visual and haptic clues, prompts along the way. And that's quite complex. And the great beauty of AI is that you are actually reinforcing learning the whole way you go along through this journey. And that's what I think will actually allow for this step change, that robots or humanoid robots will continue to get better at the job while they are doing it.
Alex, I just Googled the global population, 8 billion people. Elon Musk projects that by 2040, so within 15 years, humans will be outnumbered by robots. Agree or disagree?
I think we all know, Andrew, that Elon Musk is hardly one who's shy of making bold predictions. And I guess if you do the maths, it would obviously imply an absolutely huge uptake in humanoids, bearing in mind that there are fewer than 5 million, as we touched on earlier on today. I think really there are a couple of factors to consider. Number one is cost, first of all. Robots today, humanoid robots, are not cheap. Good news, of course, is that the cost is coming down, and we expect that with any technology. If you look at, say, how much the price of semiconductor chips has come down, how much the price of solar panels has come down, there's every reason to believe that the cost of humanoids will continue to fall. If my memory serves me correctly, we've seen something like a 30% reduction even in the past year. So that's factor number one that would need to happen in order for Elon's prediction to come true. Factor number two is also the public acceptance. And this is really an intriguing idea in the sense that we have argued regularly in the work we've done at Heptagon. Any new technology, it should be a complement. And there has never been any technology in the history of the world that has resulted in net job losses. I don't worry personally about losing my job to AI, but where I might worry is someone who knows how to use AI better than I do. And I think if I were a factory owner, I might perhaps employ the same logic with regard to humanoid. But we need to get through that acceptance fund or hump as well. And then I think the third lesson or third observation, just to put some context or framework around that comment of Elon, is really this idea that it's typically important to manage expectations. So don't have too high hopes of any novel technology. Why not under-promise and over-deliver? Don't over-anthropomorphize about what robots can or cannot do.
Let's talk about the need for human robots. The boomer generation here in the United States, those born between 1946 and 1964, are soon set to retire. I think Goldman Sachs has projected a 2% shortfall in US manufacturing labor. And as far as the global elderly healthcare provision goes, they're projecting a 4% deficiency. Explain to us, Alex, where humanoids will fill the gap.
And I think, Andrew, to an extent, you've already answered your own question in the sense that if we have a shrinking working population and a growing elderly population, there is an obvious gap that needs to be filled there. And in an environment where immigration is becoming an increasingly contentious topic, and given the sort of structural advantages, if you will, of humanoid robots, i.e., that all other things being equal, they're not going to complain, there'll be many other factors that also support the business case for humanoids that we can touch on. You can see a very logical scenario where robots will be replacing many of those boomers retiring, and equally for elderly provision, whether it is either companionship or actually that scenario where you have a robot, say, lifting an elderly person who may struggle to move around quickly. The humanoid could potentially undertake to dispense medications that someone needs. These are very plausible scenarios.
Now, there are some very clear benefits to employing humanoids. They might do a better job, they work harder, and I'd imagine we don't have to give them holidays. But give us a bigger picture take on some of those advantages, Alex.
I guess the way I'd answer that, Andrew, is always stepping back and you think about the premise behind sort of modern economics, if you will. And it's all about the efficient allocation of scarce resource. So if I'm a business owner, how do I get the best ROI on any given investment? And the great beauty of having a humanoid, let's say, relative to an old-fashioned real-world human, you touched on already the fact robots will not, as far as we know, holidays. They're not going to sick. They're not going to need parking spaces for their vehicles. They're not going to need insurance provision. They're not going to need, say, bathroom breaks during the day. They're not going to get headhunted, as it were, to another organization. And I suppose there's also a dynamic that in most jobs, we are being quite happy getting into the office 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning, leaving 5 to 6 p.m. in the evening. And that's the sort of convention, broadly speaking, around the world. If I'm a robot and maybe battery packs can be swapped in or out, some robots may be tethered to a permanent power source via a cable, you could have a scenario where humanoids are actually working 24 hours a day. So when you do the maths, you say, okay, even today, where these robots are arguably at the most expensive, at the most inefficient they will ever cost, as we said, is only going to come down as the technology scales and improve. Your ROI for a business is actually going to go up massively from here.
Everybody around me in the Interactive Brokers office is here. They're all proper human colleagues. Tell us some of the current use cases for humanoids that you're thinking about or seeing.
In some ways, Andrew, it's not dissimilar to the path that conventional robots have taken. So, in other words, there are some industry that are naturally very well suited to the deployment of humanoid. So, probably the best use case, and maybe where some of Elon's optimism comes from as well, is actually in the auto industry. So, where Tesla models have been built, for example, but equally there have been very public details about what BMW is doing, what Mercedes is doing, a few other car makers, I believe. And robots go beyond that very simple sort of spraying of paint that an old-fashioned robotic arm might, but they can actually lifting body parts of a car, fitting wheels, whatever it might be. And that can be a very clear cost saving, particularly in an industry with quite low margins, as our listeners know. The other really obvious industry where we are seeing robots being deployed today is within warehouses. And if you think about warehouses again, you might have certain robots picking or packing goods. But actually, again, think about the visual and the haptic clues or prompts that we touched on earlier on, being able to distinguish between a blue book and a red book, let's say, or picking up a book that's actually got quite a thick width. It's actually quite complex. And then you have to say, pick up a soccer ball. And for a human, that's very easy. For a humanoid, for an old fashioned robot, it's quite complicated. Now it's getting increasingly easy. The other great or cool thing about humanoids, and certainly many of the things that I've read, would suggest that they can actually weigh to about kilos, which means, again, in terms of the speed and the tasks they can undertake in a warehouse, that's quite compelling. The third use case I touch on, just in the interest of time for our listeners, would be think about on construction sites, you're doing remote monitoring of, say, telecoms or electricity infrastructure, even windows being read about, which is quite a dangerous task that some humans are quite reluctant to undergo. These are quite plausible scenarios where we may see humanoids deployed.
I think one of the most talked about gaps that humanoids will fill is in elderly care. Alex, can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, Sandra, we touched on this earlier on, and I think the clear scenario that you have is where people are going to be retiring. We've got huge demographic dynamic at work here, and we regularly say in our conversations with our clients, when demographics comes up as a discussion topic, demographics basically means that the future has already happened. So we know what's coming down the track: more elderly people, a shrinking available workforce to care for those elderly people. And this is exactly where the humanoids come in. And as we said, given their lifting abilities, bear in mind also one super exciting thing we didn't touch on earlier is that just like your iPhone will receive regular over-the-air updates and new software functionalities built into it, if you think about how humanoids will work, exactly the same thing will happen. New suites of learning, ways of interacting or helping it will become increasingly prevalent. The other thing is that you're a humanoid robot and patient A with whom you're dealing is an a national speaker of the English language. Patient B is a speaker of Mandarin. The robot does not need any specific language skills. The software module, if you will, simply will allow you to translate and perform tasks in any language, which is a massive cost saving or beneficiary for any healthcare institution.
Alex, in the piece you wrote recently on the Heptagon Capital website, The Real Robot Revolution, a very informative piece. You said that we should expect a swath of product launches in 2025. Give us a few examples of what you're expecting to see revealed this year.
I guess to add on to that question, Andrew, is perhaps to give some framing, but last year we saw $11 billion of venture capital money flow into the humanoid space. And there's a whole list of exciting startups that we cited in our paper that's available on the website, as you said. Equally, for anyone who attended CES in Las Vegas in January or read about the commentary there, a lot of noise about humanoids. Similarly, a third point would be look at the commentary from NVIDIA. Even, I believe, earlier on this week, both Amazon and Meta have made commentary about humanoids and how they may feature within their universe. Rather than actually pointing to specific product launches, I think it would be very fair to say that we are going to see increasing noise, increasing momentum. And just as we said earlier on, we're at a very early stage today. 1.3 billion humanoids at best in circulation. I would say today that number is only going to increase exponentially from here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex Gunt, Portfolio Manager at Heptagon Capital. Thank you for joining me today.
Always a pleasure, Andrew. I look forward to continuing our dialogue on a subsequent occasion.
Brilliant. And I will put a link to the Real Robot Revolution article into the show notes below on the IBKR campus website. So take a look out for that. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget, please subscribe wherever you download your podcast from.
The analysis in this material is provided for information only and is not and should not be construed as an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to buy any security. To the extent that this material discusses general market activity, industry, or sector trends, or other broad-based economic or political conditions, it should not be construed as research or investment advice. To the extent that it includes references to specific securities, commodities, currencies, or other instruments, those references do not constitute a recommendation by IBKR to buy, sell, or hold such investments. This material does not and is not intended to take into account the particular financial conditions, investment objectives, or requirements of individual customers. Before acting on this material, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and, as necessary, seek professional advice.